Hi, and welcome to part 4 of Just War 101, the final video in which we're going to be talking about just war future, how our grasp of war can improve, and why it's important to maintain just war tradition. So, in Just War Future, I want to talk about the history that we could think more deeply about and how that might influence and improve our understanding of war and its moral substance, rather than just relying on kind of abstract philosophical ideas that are proposed by people who have never been to war, like Augustine, Aquinas, Grotius, Walzer, Ramsay. I think we can reimagine what the history and the tradition has been in order to innovate new ways of thinking about it, new models that are more reflective and accepting of the lived experience of war, and frankly more responsive to our own Christian narratives. And so I want to go through a number of soldier saints that are at least as credible as church doctors like Augustine and Aquinas, particularly in matters of national violence. And I'll also say, before I get started with Augustine, I did an essay not too long ago, it's a couple of years ago, where I talked about how the fact that most of the places where we see Augustine talk about jus in bello, I talked about this in video part 1, most of the places where he talks about it are actually letters. It's not the city of God. There's something like 7 instances in a very long book. But in his epistles, his letters to Marcellinus, Boniface, his letter to Faustus the Manichaean, this is where we find the majority of his mention of jus in bello. And when we think about epistles, when we think and we engage with what Augustine's doing, his letter to Boniface, for example, Boniface was a military general secretary. It's kind of, depending how you interpret the Latin and the historical context, he had something to do with the military, and he wanted to be a monk, Boniface. You can look him up on Wikipedia. I think he's called like Count Boniface, but he wanted to leave his life behind to become a monk. And a lot of folks will say, well, he told Boniface it's okay to serve, and he reflects in the city of God that that John, the baptizer, didn't tell the soldiers in Luke 3 that they couldn't be soldiers, and so clearly it must be okay. What Augustine is doing in his letters is not creating some systematic account of war. What he's doing is responding to the needs of an individual Christian. He's being a pastor to them. And so I think just war could be much more effectively leveraged as a pastoral theology rather than a systematic theology, based upon the actual tradition and the history that we take from it. Again, in Aquinas, he's instructing in his Summa Theologica, he's instructing priests on taking confession. And when that is the assumed position of the reader, of a penitent, it begins to take a different shape. So rather than justifying our violence by saying, oh, well, we don't have to repent of it because it's not a sin. Well, no, actually it is. And the history, the tradition that we have as Christians speaks against that. That yes, war and violence are sins, but Augustine and Aquinas are not doing the thing that most scholars will tell you that they're doing. And so I think engaging with the tradition more deeply will allow us to be more credible in our application of ancient concepts in our own world. But in this last segment, I want to talk about some of the soldier saints whose lives complicate that that line between church and state, between God and country. Sebastian of Avila, the patron saint of athletes, he was killed in 288, and he's actually known as the saint who was martyred twice because he was shot through with arrows. He managed to survive, and then he goes back to when the Emperor Diocletian is having a parade, and he starts hurling insults at the emperor, and so the emperor has him beaten to death and beheaded, and then his body is preserved and he's made a saint. And so this is a soldier who, because he was an officer, in the earliest military martyr stories, It's mostly officers who are martyred because when some of these formal pogroms were made against Christians, the emperor doesn't have his claws in like the lowest enlisted soldiers or even the centurions. He has it in the officers in and around Rome, the officers around legionary headquarters, and so the highest ranking. If you were a Christian and you refused to pinch incense to the idols, if there's more attention on you, and so again, most of what we have has a lot to do with the higher ups, the brass. Even though I think it's something that we can learn from. So like Sebastian is one of many soldier saints and military martyrs who are officers, but there are others. Maximilian of Tebessa, who was killed in 295, who refused to serve in the military, refused to accept a dog tag, refused to be measured for his uniform. He refused to be conscripted, so he would have been enlisted. And he's a really popular saint for pacifists because of his really harsh stance. But there's also Marcellus of Tangier, who threw down his weapons and the laurel crown in 298, saying it's not fitting for a Christian who serves Christ the Lord to serve human powers. He had served for some time when he came to that point where he could no longer do it. And so he had served for, I don't know how many years. He was an officer, if I remember correctly. And his relics, after he was killed, John Howard Yoder managed to get them, or some of the relics, from Tangier, brought to the altar at Notre Dame University in Indiana. And for the longest time, people didn't know who Marcellus was. And it's kind of funny that there's a huge ROTC contingent there, but their relics under the altar are actually a pacifist who refused to continue in his service. George of Palestine is another one. He was killed in 303. He's the patron saint of the British Empire, but he was actually killed by the powers that be that ruled the empire. What is noteworthy of his passion is that he was killed repeatedly over and over and over again. He would get killed, resuscitated, killed, resuscitated, killed, resuscitated. And there is some truth to the story, even if it's hard to believe now that someone dies and resuscitated. There's clearly some hyperbole going on, but we do have there is some historical reliability to George's passion and being killed. Francis of Assisi, skipping forward many centuries. Many of us know who he is, but we don't always realize the impact he has and how his experience informed what he did. He was a prisoner of war after a brutal battle against Perugia in the early 1200s. The early 1200s. And what he did actually was he wanted to go to the Holy Land desperately. It was in the middle of the Third Crusade, and he couldn't go without an armed guard. And he tries to go. He then sees the Sultan, probably to be martyred or desiring to be martyred. It didn't work out. And so he lived the rest of his life, and he created nativities. The two years before his death, he created a living nativity in a cave in Greccio on the land of another veteran who was sympathetic to his cause, and he preached this sermon as the priest celebrated the Eucharist with a donkey, a mule, and there's an empty cradle, and in the cradle Francis saw a vision of the infant Christ, and that is now our nativity scenes. I talk about this in my most recent book, God is a Grunt and More Good News for GIs. I dedicate an entire chapter to Francis's experience and how that influenced not only nativity scenes but also the Stations of the Cross that you see in churches, which is more his movement than him. But he so desired to get to the Holy Land that his order was eventually made the custodians of the Holy Land by Muslims. And when they were banished for a short time, they could no longer take people around on the Stations of the Cross in Jerusalem, so they did it within their churches. And eventually, by the 1700s, all the churches in the Catholic world, and then eventually all churches elsewhere, were allowed to have Stations of the Cross. So you could go to the Holy Land without having to go to the Holy Land. And it's this incredibly non-violent, like anti-crusade. So you could do this thing that the Crusades were mostly entered into to do, which is to go to the Holy Land without violence. You didn't actually have to rely on violence. You didn't have to use violence. All you had to do was go there in your heart. Ignatius of Loyola, another major founder of a major order. He spent time as a Spanish knight, and then he's injured in a battle. And as he's convalescing, he reads the Gospels, and he decides he wants to live this adventurous, dangerous life that the early saints did. And before he goes off to study in seminary and become a priest and found the order of Jesuits, he took his military vestments and his weapons down and laid them at the foot of the Black Madonna in Montserrat Abbey in Spain. And what's noteworthy about that is that it sounds a lot like a vigil. A knight's vigil was what a novice would begin the evening before he would be made a knight. He would lay all of his armor and his swords and everything on the altar, and he would pray for 8 hours overnight. And then the next day he would be made a knight, and he would begin his military service. But Ignatius does this before starting seminary and founding the Jesuits. So it seems as though, if he doesn't say it explicitly, his actions imply that his military service was his being a priest. In fact, his order takes an extra oath of obedience to the Pope, and they're known sometimes as God's Marines or the Pope's Marines, because unfortunately they had a big part to do with the Inquisition, and now there are more Jesuit universities than any other Catholic order has, so they're big into education and formation. In our own day, Howard Zinn, who wrote the People's History of almost everything, he was a World War II veteran. I think he was a pilot, and he became a historian and peace activist afterwards. David Courtright, who was a Vietnam veteran, active in Vietnam Veterans Against the War, wrote an early book called Soldiers in Revolt, and he is a historian, a Gandhi scholar, and a scholar of nonviolence, all after his military service. Finally, Joshua Castile, who wrote Letters from Abu Ghraib, was an interrogator at Abu Ghraib in Iraq the same time I was, and I should have updated it, but he sadly did not survive cancer. He passed in August of 2013, I think. But he, as an interrogator, had an incredible change of heart, wrote Letters from Abu Ghraib, and unfortunately died far too young, but had a life set up to do some incredible things and was unable to do them because of burn pits. And then finally, there's plenty of others: John of God, Desmond Doss, Camillus of Lellis, Maurice and Theban Legion, Francis Samsus, Pachomius, Phil Berrigan. All of these soldier saints you can learn about in my second book, For God and Country, in that order. You can, if you need a quick redirect URL, it's there at the bottom, forgodandcountry.com. But you can also go to pewpewhq.com/merch and find it there for purchase. And I talk about a number of other soldier saints that might help us think through more deeply and critically what it means to be Christian, what it means to be called to service, and what it means to be a person of faith, trying to be, an example for others in a broken world that relies all too frequently on violence. If you've watched all 4 videos, thank you so much. I appreciate your attention and your interest. If you have questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll get to them as much as I can. But you're always free to go to pewpewhq.com and learn more, get some merch, read some essays or blogs, and think what it means to be a Christian soldier. I think you'll find there's much more than meets the eye, and I hope that that I can help you on that journey to discovering what it really means to be a Christian soldier.